Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here this afternoon, and knowing how busy working from home and clinical responsibilities are for everyone, I appreciate your time. So what we're going to do today to enable you to develop the most competitive possible pilot grant proposal is really work on tips and strategies to prepare the project description. I'm happy to address questions as we move along. And again, we'll save some time for questions at the end. And I do want to thank Megan Reeves and Camille Charlet for all their assistance with making this workshop possible. And I look forward to your feedback too. Okay, contacts for you to be aware of at the WVCTSI include Megan Reeves and Camille Charlet, and hopefully with your pilot proposals, you've already been in touch. We have some senior faculty, Dr. Campo, Dr. DeVries, who can be helpful if needed, though I would note they're fairly busy, but they'll try to assist. But I wanted to, in particular, note two biostatisticians, Dr. Krista Lilly and Dr. Sinjin Wen. And if you need support for writing up your scientific rigor and the statistical analysis for your research plan, do hop on the iLab site and request their services, and they'll get back to you very promptly. And they're excellent resources, and I encourage you to use this as an opportunity to get to know them. So as we turn to writing a proposal, the WVCTSI uses the review process that's very similar, if not identical, to the NIH. And I went over aspects of that on our previous workshop, so you can view those notes if needed. But this is just a reminder. When you're writing for research funding, anytime you're writing a research proposal, you're trying to do your best to communicate the importance of your ideas and the fact that you're prepared to conduct the proposed research study you've proposed, and then your research study has some outstanding outcomes that will serve as new contributions to address whatever question or disease process you're focused on. But the individuals who are reading your proposal and reviewing it and assigning it a priority score are likely folks you're never going to meet due to confidentiality. You'll probably, hopefully, never know who they are. But remember, you're not writing a novel. This is not the time to craft long sentences. This is a time to pretend you're a reporter for the New York Times, and you're writing very short, direct sentences. And these are busy folks just like you, so you have to make their job easy, and that's part of what I'll be sharing with you today, some strategies to make your reviewer's job easy so they're impressed with your proposal. And again, your goal is to excite and persuade your reviewers. And this is our image of a reviewer at work in a hotel room. In this case, I might need to show a screenshot of a reviewer at home due to COVID-19. But it's the same issue. You need to think how what you're writing gets the reviewers to be excited about your proposal. And again, you don't want them to have question marks. What was that about? You don't want it overly repetitious, particularly in a pilot proposal, because you don't have a lot of space. And you don't want them to say, oh, typos. What you want them to do is say, hey, this is an interesting idea. I think we should support it. I think this team is ready to go. I really want to give it a score that puts it in the funding range. And keep in mind, a successful proposal means you have effectively communicated your ideas to another individual who, much like you, cherishes and values biomedical research, whether it's clinical, basic, and/or translational. So today we're going to focus on the elements that make writing a successful proposal. And this is any proposal, but I know you're all working for your submissions to the WVCTSI. So your proposal needs to have a high likelihood of producing results that are going to make a difference. And that's what we call an impact. And the way to approach sharing your impact is how you emphasize the importance of what you're doing in the background, significance, and innovation sections. We'll talk about that in more detail. You also need to keep the proposal easy to understand, and I'll give you some tips on that. And one of the best tips right from the beginning is it needs to be organized, and it needs to be logical, and it needs to be easy to pick up and read, put it down again, pick it up the next day, and the reviewer knows what you're chatting about. And then you need to know, as the writer, what are the instructions? That's your challenge. And certainly Megan Reeves and Camille Charlet can address any questions you have. And then think to how the proposal will be reviewed. And that's in the program announcement. And you want to make sure if there are any questions that the proposal is asking you to address, that you include that. So the bottom line is you need to write to the review criteria. And last time we met, for those of you who are online today, we discussed how the specific aims page, this one page, is perhaps the most important part of your proposal. And it's a one-page read that for your reviewer, they can quickly understand what the goals and objectives, the hypothesis, and your proposed experiments, and the outcomes of those experiments. And I really like spending time on specific aims pages because I can take one page and share it with my colleagues and get some feedback. And that reality check oftentimes is tremendously helpful, especially when you're writing a pilot proposal, because remember, your pilot proposal is only for a 12-month period. So you need to be very honest and direct and critical of evaluating, is my proposal too ambitious? And working on that with your specific aims page is the way to go. I'd also add this can be the hardest part to write, but once you have your specific aims page together, then it's easy to move forward with other portions. And again, specific aims help you sort out the logic of your proposal, check out the feasibility, the scope. I also think it helps you sometimes think, hey, I need another collaborator with extra expertise. And it enables you to get feedback on your proposal. Excuse me for a minute. Okay, with that being said, keep in mind there are pilot grant requirements, and I think you all have that information. We're going to focus today on the approach research strategy. You'll have 5 pages in total. So some of my presentation will focus on how best to use those 5 pages. And our goal is to craft a research strategy plan that's compelling. And we'll do that by focusing on 3 sections of the proposal: the background / significance, innovation, and the approach. And the approach part actually becomes the part that the reviewers are going to look at most critically, because that's where they're going to look to see if you've considered all the important aspects of your project that will enable you to have a positive outcome of your proposed research idea. So let's get started. And sometimes you'll see the wording in a proposal. It says project description. NIH uses the term research strategy, but essentially this is the body of the proposal. So my suggestion, now that you've got your one-page specific aims page, hopefully nearby and it's in great shape, before you go any farther, the first step is make an outline of the rest of the proposal, of those 5 pages, and put in the main headers. Background and significance, maybe that's section A or section 1. Section B or section 2 should be innovation. And then the third section, whether you call it section 3 or C, is the approach. And we recommend, though it's up to you to decide how to use your 5 pages, that you keep the background, significance, and innovation sections short, maybe 1 page, maybe a page and a quarter. But if you write 2 pages of background information and then talk about innovation for another half page, you won't have sufficient page length to really describe how you're going to conduct the research. And I will share with you, if you have a very good specific aims page, your reviewers are going to understand what your goals are, what your research question is. So the background and significance and the importance of what's new in your project, which is innovation, can be brief, because if they understood from your specific aims page what you're doing, they're going to be more interested in how are you going to do this. So I like to think of background and significance as the question why. Why is this research important? Innovation is, okay, what's new? But the approach is, how are you going to conduct this research and generate the outcomes that you have proposed? So I hope that makes sense. And again, the background that you need to supply really helps to justify why your research study is needed. And keep in mind, as the grant writer of your proposal, you need to advocate for why your research is needed. So add some background that briefly describes some of the work that others have already done. Some of it may be your own work or your colleagues in your department or your institution. The significance needs to be highlighted, and the definition of significance is one we have taken fairly much from the National Institutes of Health. Significance is, what's the positive effect that if you successfully complete this research project, you're going to provide some new information that's going to help solve an NIH relevant research question, which is biomedical research and clinical practice. And then you justify the need for your proposal by highlighting what's new about your proposal. And it doesn't have to be a lot of information. It can just be really showing how there are 1 or 2 things in your proposal that are really going to contribute something new to how we think about a disease or a research question or a mechanism or your favorite research question. So let's briefly look at significance and innovation. And for the pilot proposal, you're asked to give some background, so you can call this section background/significance. This is a section where you have a few paragraphs, not a lot, but where you can increase the level of information that you provide in the specific aims. This is where you can highlight some of the current literature in the field. And this is where you can prepare your reader to understand the gap in knowledge that your research project will address. So I like to think of significance with the question, why? Why is this research question important? Why is the gap in knowledge that you want to solve and address important? And also, what is the positive effect when you complete your experiments and your studies? How you will have contributed new knowledge to solving an important health-related question. So your challenge as the grant writer is to help your reviewers understand why your proposal is timely, is relevant, and important to your field. And you may even want to pull out the buzzwords to say this research project is timely because we've identified the need to understand mechanisms related to COVID-19, for example. Why your project may be relevant is this orphan disease has not really been advanced until this recent information, and why something, your research is important to your field. I'm, for example, a neuropharmacologist, and I'm very interested in G protein coupled receptors in the brain. So I would explain that I'm looking at a new way to look at a serotonin receptor in the brain on a certain cell type and brain region. And then I'll explain why this information is important, not only to others studying serotonin receptors in the brain, but to the field of neuroscience and the field of endocrinology, and perhaps to treat diseases like depression and anxiety. So that's your challenge in the area of significance. Now, innovation is tricky because sometimes as investigators, we're a little modest. We don't want to say, oh, I'm going to be the first person to discover something, because chances are someone else on the planet has similar interest to what you're doing. Research is more of a stepwise process. But what you have to acknowledge is you're doing something that we don't yet know the answer to, which is research, and how whatever approach you're taking is going to fill a gap in what we know. So I like to think of this as you're moving that ball, that rock of Sisyphus up the mountain, just to a new level of understanding. It's not that you're going to cure cancer or overnight have a vaccine that can make COVID-19 disappear, but there is an important positive impact of your doing this research, so we have new knowledge and we can improve how we treat our patients and improve how we discover new drugs for treatment of disease, and understanding mechanisms of how things work will help us understand the etiology of a disease. So innovation is important, significance is important. And so some ways to think about innovation. Just think about what's timely or a different way to really look at an important health-related problem. Sometimes you're testing a novel hypothesis, and novel is risky because we don't always know is our hypothesis right or wrong? Sometimes we want to develop a new treatment approach. I often find sometimes here at WVU, we have a lot of interest in serving our rural state population. And so a lot of investigators are interested in taking an approach that works successfully at a modern upscale hospital like Ruby, and see how we can extend that treatment approach to smaller rural clinics. Or maybe a new state-of-the-art measurement is being used, whether it's mHealth or something else. Or maybe you're working on a new measurement of blood flow or imaging at a specific target organ. Or maybe you're even challenging an existing paradigm. I would say typically in a pilot proposal, excuse me, you may be challenging an existing paradigm, but that's a bigger project. Excuse me for a minute. Thank you. So with innovation, consider writing one brief paragraph, and I like to write a few sentences and then add maybe one or two bullets. And these bullets are essentially pointing the reviewer in the direction of what you're going to learn from doing your proposed research project. Okay, now let's turn to the approach section. And this slide has a lot of information. And I know the slides can be made available to you following our presentation today. But this is something to think about, and I've taken this from many of the NIH guidelines that are used for a traditional application to NIH, or typically something like SAMHSA or AHRQ or a foundation or other funding agencies. So the first thing that's so important is to describe what's your overall strategy. Why have you chosen to look at your question using an animal model? Why have you chosen to look at your question in a clinical trial? Then, once that is clear what your strategy is and your model, then you need to focus on the methods and the analyses that you will be using with the data you've collected to conduct the specific aims that you proposed on your specific aims page. Now, this sounds very simple when I write it this way, but this takes work. And these 4 pages that you're going to write for your approach section, I encourage you to write a draft. Don't yet worry about if you've got 5 or 6 pages, but think about each of these aspects of the approach section. Now, hopefully, you have some strategies to establish the feasibility, or what we call the workability, of the project you're proposing. Now, sometimes you're fortunate enough to have some preliminary results. Maybe you conducted a focus group, and for your community engagement and outreach project, you have a sense of whether your idea is practical and is of interest to the community. Oftentimes, as basic scientists conducting an experiment, we have a little bit of data. Maybe our replications are small and we need to scale that up in a larger project. And sometimes you may have some work that's been done in your clinic by the unit that you work with on a day-to-day basis, and they actually have collected some results. They may not be published yet, but that's still important. I would also say, if you have a publication, Whether you've been the first author or a contributing member of the research team that has published in this area that you're addressing, that's really a strength in demonstrating feasibility. But for a pilot project, it's more important to many times, let's see, let me rephrase this. With a pilot project, many times we don't yet have preliminary results, or we haven't really been able to test the concept of what we're proposing, and that's why we're writing a pilot grant. So in this case, feel free to show something from the literature. And if you show it, be sure to reference the publication and give the authors credit. Or maybe you have a model you've developed, and that's a demonstration that you've thought through how the project, your work, is going to work. And I know when I submitted my first grant application many years ago, I was a new faculty member. I had finished a postdoc, but my lab wasn't quite yet set up, and I couldn't even generate any preliminary data. So I used a figure or two from papers that I had previously published to demonstrate this was the approach that I was going to use. So again, give full credit to whoever you cite, or if you're using their strategy to demonstrate your work is ready to go. You also need to help the reviewer understand why you've chosen the methods, the models, and the approach you're taking for addressing your hypothesis. I actually, and this is a tip, I usually put in a section that's usually a few sentences that says rationale. And that catches the reviewer's eye to think about, okay, why are you taking this approach? Because I'm sure all of you know one of the hardest parts of doing research is making the choices you have to make to broaden your results down to one question and one model. You have lots of ideas, but the challenge is to hone them and make them focused. Now, when you're writing the approach section, another key part is, after you've described how you're going to do the experiments, what you expect to see. And you're going to be talking about the outcomes you anticipate and how you know your experiments or your research study is completed. But you also need to show that you know the literature and you're a good scholar. And that's by discussing potential problems. Sometimes we call that section pitfalls, limitations, and alternative approaches. That lets the reviewer know that you've already walked yourself through your research protocol and you've decided, well, if the protocol goes as I've planned, this is the outcome I should see. But however, there's always a chance. Maybe I'm going to have difficulties recruiting enough subjects, or maybe there's some confounding issue that you didn't recognize when you plan the experiments. And so you have to be prepared to adjust. Sometimes we address potential problems by having a collaborator or a colleague who has expertise with the project we're doing, or the methods, and they can help us sort through the data. We all know there's no such thing as a perfect experiment or a perfect research project, so sometimes there are limitations. For example, if I was looking at my favorite serotonin receptor subtype in a cell culture, I may run into problems where the cells that I'm working with don't express the receptor very well. Or if you're measuring something in a blood sample from your patients, you may have some sensitivity issues or limitations. that make it difficult for you to interpret your results. And always be positive, but having an alternative approach is kind of a very smart, research savvy strategy, which means you're prepared to look at the results, or if you're having difficulties with the methods, and modify them. So this section shows the reviewer that you own this project because you've thought about how things are going to work and where the potential problems might be. It doesn't mean the outcomes are any less important, but what it helps demonstrate is that you're ready to launch this project. And one of the ways I think of that is, today is Wednesday. Say you submitted your proposals tomorrow morning. Now don't panic because they're not due tomorrow on Thursday. But maybe Friday you got a letter saying, congratulations, your project is going to be funded. My way of thinking about this as a reviewer, when I read a pilot project, if you receive the notice of award on Friday, when you go back into the clinic or into the lab on Monday, will you know exactly what you need to do this project? And the proposal that really creates in the reviewer's mind that you know enough and you have the right group of collaborators and co-investigators and you have access to all the resources, that means you're ready to go. And so with pilot projects, they need to demonstrate that whatever the project is addressing, it's something you're ready to take charge of and own as the principal investigator. Now, some other things, we'll talk about this a little bit more, and this is very, very important. Nowadays, as you all know, NIH is very concerned about scientific rigor. And what we mean by that is, can the results, are they rigorously obtained so that there can be a valid statistical analysis of the results? And we talk about rigor and reproducibility because in the past decade or so, NIH has had difficulties with some of the research being challenged because it's not scientifically rigorous. And this is true not just for basic and translational studies, but for clinical trials. So including statistical analysis or your plan for the analysis is very important. And if you're not the expert in statistics, I'm not the expert in statistics, I call my friendly biostatistician, and you can do that courtesy of the CTSI and ask for their assistance. They'll chat with you about your overall design, your variables that you're measuring, your sample size, and they'll do their best to advise you how to make your project as rigorous as possible. So don't forget this, because many times in pilot projects, this piece is left out. Now, I also would say in the approach section, towards the end, you're going to want to include a timeline. And the CTSI pilot project award period is 12 months. So you can break it up into months or quarters. And I don't know how many aims you might have, but say you have 2 aims, you want to show what your plan of attack is with a timeline. The nice thing about a timeline, do something that's visual, because much of your proposal is words, and a visual really helps the reviewer instantly understand that you've thought through how you're going to conduct the research. Now, last but not least, and again, I think this slide today is maybe the most important one. You can use it as a checklist. You need to discuss your future research direction. So hopefully the results from your proposed pilot project will serve as a foundation for the next step in your research journey. So an overall strategy for the approach section, and keep in mind, you're going to have at most 4 pages, maybe a little less, maybe 3.5, to do the approach section on a pilot grant. Think of just providing sufficient information. Now, that means this is not a dissertation with 300 references. You're going to probably have 10 or 15 or 20 at the most. And this information is convince your reviewers you are ready to conduct the proposed research project when you receive the award, and that you're successfully prepared to complete the project. And sometimes you have to include a description of who your research team is. Don't forget, WVU is a large institution. I keep meeting new people at WVU almost every day. And so don't assume your reviewers know what you do every day just because you work in the emergency room, or just because you're a pediatrician, or just because you're a behavioral clinician, or you're a nurse. We don't always walk in the same places, but what we have in common is that we want to conduct some research that will benefit everyone. Now, I'm going to give you 2 approaches for how you can structure your approach section. And it really depends, first of all, on your style of writing and sometimes what you're trying to advocate for. Because remember, as the grant writer, you're the person who has to give the reviewer all the information that makes it possible for that reviewer to say, you know, when I'm in study section, this was really a great pilot project. Okay, so the first strategy is what we call a modular approach. And this works for each aim. Now, with a pilot project, I anticipate you will have at least 1 specific aim, possibly 2, but I likely not 3, because that wouldn't be feasible in a 12-month period. But with a modular approach, each specific aim has a little introduction, a little background, some preliminary results, or whatever you're choosing to show. Then you talk about the research design, what the expected outcomes are, and those tricky problems, pitfalls, limitations, alternative approaches. Then following, say, aim 1 and aim 2, you want to include a section on scientific rigor, make that a header, and then include your timeline and future directions. But for each aim, you should take these bulleted areas and replicate it. So I'll have for aim 1, introduction, 1A, background, 1B, preliminary results, aim 3, and research design, 1D, and so forth. And then for aim 2, if you have a second aim, you don't have to, you'll have aim 2, 2A, introduction, 2B, background. Notice I'm organizing the information with these headers because this helps your reviewers read through your proposal and understand the logic of what you're doing. The second approach, and a colleague calls one modular and one unitary. This is one where you have a project and you have your questions you're asking, aims 1, maybe aims 2, but perhaps this is a study design and you need to describe the protocol you're going to be using in the clinic to collect the data. So it's similar, but it's not necessarily broken up by aim. It's broken up more by the approach. So in this model, you would have an introduction, a smidgen of background, your rationale, if you have some preliminary results or others do, but then you're going to focus on the research design. So when you focus on the research design, you're going to present the rationale for the study design. For example, if you're looking at headaches in adolescents, you're going to exclude adults over a certain age. Your study population needs to be defined, particularly if you're looking at a complex question like substance abuse during pregnancy. Your study methods need to be clear and the procedures that you're going to use. And many times the study procedures or the measurements you're going to use are standardized surveys. You need to briefly introduce them and maybe include some scholarship on how they were established. Or if it's a new measurement you're developing, you're going to need to expand that new method just a bit. But with this kind of approach, you really need to emphasize how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to store it, how you're going to maintain the quality, and how you're going to manage it. And at the same time, you need to really address the data analysis, including the plans you have for statistical analysis. And then once you talk about the study design, then you want to go back to what are the outcomes that you expect from conducting this study. Again, be sure to include a brief discussion of potential problems, some alternative approaches that you anticipate doing. I know many times with clinical studies, we have issues with confounding issues with our patient sample group. And so maybe you're looking at a group at high risk for obesity, but then smoking comes up as a confound. So those are the things sometimes that you don't know until you've recruited your subjects. And again, include a timeline, and always with a pilot award, but even with any proposal, tell people what's next. What's going to be with this pilot data? I'm prepared to do X, Y, Z. And I will tell you, I'm a big fan of pilot projects. In my own career, I once had a very small $5,000 pilot award, but that enabled me to finish a project, get a paper published, and then I was able to obtain a major R01 grant application from the NIH. So start small with your pilot project, but think big. Now, briefly, what do we mean by a timeline? I'm sure you're much more creative in making diagrams than I am, but this is a basic model. If you have one aim, and again, you're only going to have 1 year for your pilot project, probably break that into months. But what's great about a timeline, one, it's a visual, so it's easy to figure out what's happening. But more importantly, it shows the reviewer that you've already taken yourself on a walk through how am I really going to begin this project when I receive that all-exciting award notice that we can go ahead. You know, sometimes it's you've got to check your animal protocols or through approval. Sometimes you have to check on your IRB. Many times you have to schedule space for focus groups. But once you get the go-ahead, you should know what the steps are to complete your pilot project. And obviously, whoever is providing you support for your pilot projects want you to successfully complete the project so they can report that and you can publish your results because that will help you. So here are my tips for a successful approach section. So I'm Keep in mind, we talked earlier about background significance and innovation. So I think those are important too. But the approach section is the part the reviewers are going to look to see, are you ready to launch? So my first step always is I make the outline. I decide, am I going to use the modular approach? Am I going to do a unitary approach? And I write all the headers. I actually cut and paste the wording I used on my specific aims page right into the approach section. Then I usually figure out what tables and figures I need to use because they take up room. And every time you use a figure or a table, which I think is very important, it takes away from that space you have. But step 3 is the hardest. Write that first draft. Once you have that first draft, put it down for a few days, let it get dusty, go off and do your laundry or do your dishes or go back to the clinic or whatever you do online or go for a walk. Then come back and edit the sections to meet the submission guidelines you have. Because I find sometimes it's easier once we've gotten everything out of our brains and it's on paper, it's easier to go back and say, well, in the background and significance, I already talked about that. I don't need it so much in the approach. You can customize it and chop it down to that length. And then once you have a draft that you think is about the right length, it doesn't have to be perfect yet, print out your specific aims page or put them up side by side on your screen and make sure what you say in your specific aims is actually what you're doing in your approach section. You have to make sure the two are the same. There's nothing that gets a reviewer a little more unhappy, and we all want happy reviewers. And of course, there's no way to put chocolate in your application for your reviewers. So you have to make your specific aims page not miss the approach section, but meet in the middle. Okay? And then last but not least, run spell check, polish it. And I'll give you some tips on polishing. And these, I should call these looks matter. Okay? Your proposal is a reflection on you as a professional. So if your proposal is a teeny tiny font and someone like me is your reviewer, I wear trifocals and I probably need a magnifying glass to read it, that's not going to make me be a happy reviewer. So make your proposal easy to read by including white space between every paragraph. And I work with grant writers like yourself all the time, and they're horrified. Oh, I need to say something. It's more important that it's easy for the reviewer to read quickly than it is for you to say things over and over. Now, nothing puts a reviewer to sleep faster than if there's no white space. And that's what we mean by the text being too dense. If I just get a solid page with no headers, no spaces, I can't tell what's important. So your job is to use white space to avoid being too dense. And then I think you all know the KISS principle. Keep it short, keep it simple. Simple does not mean conceptually what you're doing is not sophisticated. It's just you're stating it in clear language. And then don't forget, your job as a grant writer is to say, hey, I've got this great idea. I'm going to address this gap in knowledge. Look at my aims. They're good questions. But you need to communicate the outcomes of your research project. How will these outcomes improve our knowledge in the field of serotonin receptors? Or how will they help us treat neonatal abstinence syndrome in children? Or how will healthcare practice be improved with the use of mHealth? So your outcome is going to be your outcome, but you have to make sure your reviewers don't miss it by omitting it. And many times folks forget in their proposals to really talk about the outcomes. Now, will a pilot project cure COVID-19? Absolutely not. We all wish it would. Then we could all go back to seeing each other in person. But the research project you're proposing is important. So don't sell yourself short. Really be an advocate for why your project is important. Now, what does NIH say? And this is just a place for you to get some additional reading. The National Institute, NIAID, Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has wonderful information. And I encourage you to go to grants.gov and you can just click on all the information that's there. This particular part that we've highlighted gives examples of how to describe a method in your approach section. And if you need to have access to a needed piece of equipment, how to point that out, and explaining this is the current the status of the current research in my field and how my own work is going to add to that. And again, make sure your reviewers understand what you're talking about to grasp the importance of what you're proposing. So again, NIH has lots of resources. Take advantage of them, and that should be helpful. And again, I encourage you to be your own reviewer. Once you have your draft written, you have to ask these questions of yourself. And this is what a reviewer has to say. Oh, I read your proposal, Joan. Yeah, I think the reviewers are going to be able to understand what you're going to get done for this pilot project. It's a little ambitious, but you know what? It's not way over ambitious. Oh, I'm really impressed. The PI has shown they understand pitfalls and alternatives. So I think if they get stuck, they've got a great team, they'll figure it out. And will the experiments generate meaningful data? This is important. And I saw a statistical analysis plan that made me convinced they're on the right path. And will the resulting data prove the hypothesis? And if there are others already doing the work, or has it already been completed, sometimes that's a clue to the fact that it's a great question. Sometimes it's a clue to it's a difficult question. So take a look at these resources at NIH and NIAID, and there's a lot of good information for you if you need food for thought. Last but not least, some insider tips. Always make use of graphics and tables because they can be worth 1,000 words. Make sure your font size is appropriate and make sure your figures and graphs aren't misleading. So be sure to label them, be accurate. And this example I think is great because it shows us what a little bit of color is like. And I think now I'm going to turn this over to Camille Charlet and Megan Reeves because they can tell you a little bit more about what the reviewers for the WVCTSI look for. So Megan or Camille, some thoughts on this?
Sure, thank you, Joan. I'm gonna unmute Camille and I. And Joan, I've requested to control your screen.
Thank you.
I should, let's see.
Yep.
Okay, good, so I can control your screen. I was gonna see first, we're kind of at a, ooh, sorry about this, everyone.
There's questions.
So we do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it recommended to add some history to the research that we are proposing under the innovation section?
I would recommend, that's a very good question. I would say I would put that history or scholarship back in the background and significance and have the innovation section just focus on your project. Okay? That doesn't mean you can't talk about history, but context should be earlier.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, was that Mala?
I've
Yes.
unmuted everyone, and I'm going to be sharing my screen next. So,
Okay.
Omar, I can answer your question as far as the template. For CTSI pilot grants, you will see in the RFA, if you kind of scroll down, the top part is usually sort of a general overview. And then when you scroll down, you have more detailed instructions. And we have links to the template for that. So our regular grants usually use the NIH template. And then we have a couple grants that have sort of a simplified one, but everything is linked in there. So for each one, you will know specifically what is needed. So that's a great question.
so can everyone see my screen now, and what do CTSI reviewers look for?
Yes.
Yes.
So I think we touched about this a little bit before, but future directions. So since this is a pilot funding, and one of the ways that WVCTSI continues to exist and will continue to exist, we'll actually write our own CTSI renewal over the next year. But we depend on making good investments in researchers. So if you can describe a little bit about what your future direction would be like, and even targeting a specific grant, if you've found a funding announcement that is open for the foreseeable future, you can even reference that specifically. So in addition to the normal NIH criteria for scoring, external competitiveness is something that our reviewers will score you on. So a paragraph, a sentence or two, just about what you plan to do next and how you plan to submit an external proposal if everything goes well with your pilot grant goes a long way. Consultations with WVCTSI services. Joan mentioned that we have biostatisticians available to help, and they will actually help you develop your biostatistical and study design considerations. So take advantage of them. They can give you a couple sentences or review and provide feedback on your methods, your sample size calculation, how you plan to do your analysis. So use their expertise and include that, and you're more than free to include a letter of support from whatever particular biostatistician that you were working with. They're happy to write a letter of support for that, and reviewers will look for that. And I think, it's pretty much a requirement now for NIH grants that you have a biostatistician on the team and they have effort on your project. So it just is good practice to start to develop some of those relationships as you're writing pilot grants and then moving forward. Publication track record. Some of you are early stage investigators, so our reviewers will keep that in mind. But if you've got some type of track record, you'll want to highlight that in your biosketch. We didn't talk a ton about biosketches, but that is something that reviewers will look at. If you have mentors, make sure they're appropriate, and grantsmanship is what Joan was talking about with using the white space, using figures, making sure that everything is appropriate. So something to kind of keep in mind in a preview, we're planning to do a third session, and we're looking at April 22nd, I think it's a Wednesday, in the afternoon, to really talk about clinical trials considerations. So start thinking now. The sooner that you decide whether this is a clinical trial or not, the better your proposal will be. So these are the 4 questions that you would answer if you're planning for a clinical trial. And it's a note that clinical trials are not limited to pharmacological interventions. It could be a behavioral intervention. It could be an educational intervention. Anything that you're introducing new to these study participants and you're going to measure a behavioral or biomedical outcome at the end of it bumps it up to a clinical trial. It doesn't necessarily mean it's high risk or even moderate risk. You can have very low risk clinical trials, but there are additional considerations to think about and additional things that you'll be scored on. Your clinical trial protocol, this is a new requirement, and we'll spend more time, I think, talking about this in a future session, but something to think about, that it ties in very closely to your approach section, is writing your clinical trial protocol. And this is different than what is just in your KC IRB protocol, you know, the questionnaire that guides this. A lot of what is in the KC IRB protocol is transferable to a clinical trial protocol. But the clinical trial protocol is a single document that helps to guide a full proposal. So there's good clinical practice guidelines, and each of the bullets, I won't read them to you, are the headers that you should include in your clinical trial protocol. And why is it helpful? I mean, it's a detailed plan of your study, and you know, especially if you've got co-investigators, a co-PI, study personnel, a study coordinator, they don't want to go through and sort through your IRB questionnaire. It's a single document that anybody can pick up and run the study. So I think this speaks a little bit to some of the rigor and reproducibility that Joan was mentioning earlier. There's been issues in the past with people being able to replicate studies, but if you have a very detailed protocol, you should be able to submit that as evidence and know that you're conducting a rigorous study. There are a lot of resources to help develop a clinical trials protocol, and we will send this slide deck to everyone that was on the call today to your email so you can review this. So here are some good resources for you. We've talked in the past about CTSI membership. It's sort of our last plug-in for that, but I just wanted to mention this again, and here's where you actually log in and join to be a member. So I'm gonna stop sharing and see if there are additional questions that everybody has, or if anybody has any additional questions. I think there's maybe one. Nope, I think we've already answered that. Camille, is there anything that you'd like to add from my?
No, I think that's pretty good. That's it. And Joan's lecture is really fantastic. So I hope you all will take the time to look at the slides and refer to them when you are writing, whether it's for pilots or something else. And then I just kind of want to reiterate what I said before with the application template is it doesn't really matter if it's CTSI or any other agency. Really do take the time to comb through the RFA and see what they are asking for. Both in terms of formatting, like the template, and also in terms of content. And we definitely do in ours, and most agencies do. They will include review criteria and how they will actually judge the applications. So I think that's a good, it's good practice to actually get an understanding of what the reviewers are going to be looking for, for any particular RFA or funding mechanism. So definitely be familiar with it. There's definitely no harm, and I think you can only improve your application by looking into that.
Dr. Mala, I think has a question, so I've unmuted you. Dr. Mala?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So in regards to the clinical trial protocol write-up, I have a quick question on that. As I told you last week, I was thinking of an idea and start to put it on a paper and start to have like a draft of an LOI ready. And then later on, I was thinking more about it. In terms of an LOI, is it better to write as we do for the grants, write it under each specific aims? However, the clinical trials, if I do a small randomized pilot study, I always would like to start with an approach section, which makes my writing process easier, and then to go back retrospectively and write the aims. So what is the recommended strategy to get an initial draft? Is an LOI better or an approach better, or how do you guys recommend?
Joan, I mean, I can jump in, but Joan, please, if you have anything to add, please do. I think specific aims are always the right place to start. at least getting those out there and knowing what your outcomes are and how you're going to measure them and be successful, I think that kind of then translates if you're doing a clinical trial, what the clinically or what the biomedical or behavioral outcomes are and what is going to be your primary outcome and how you're going to measure it. I think those will tie in a little bit. And then, so you might, switch back and forth a little bit and maybe write them in tandem, but from my perspective, I would definitely start with your specific aims, and then think about, as your clinical trial, think about what your primary outcome is going to be, and then that will help to inform you of what tests or what tools, what surveys, what labs you're going to run, and then the approach will kind of come in a little bit after that. But Joan?
Yeah, Megan, I think you're right on. I think, first of all, draft those specific aims. They don't have to be perfect, but that'll help you figure out the language you need for then writing the LOI. You don't want to spend any time writing the approach until you've received approval to move forward after your letter of intent. And so, time is the most precious gift that each of you have, and time to devote to research is extra special. So, write that specific aims and get some feedback on it from folks that understand what you're trying to do. And then when you feel it's pretty confident, then you've got the language in that specific aims to sort of complete the letter of intent. Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, great question. Thank you.